Jack was an adventurous man who loved traveling to new places. He always wanted to do something exciting and different to grab attention on social media. This time, he was visiting a famous royal palace. The palace was known for its beautiful architecture and the royal guards who stood outside. The guards were famous for their serious expressions and discipline. They never moved or spoke, no matter what happened around them. As Jack walked around the palace, he noticed a small crowd watching the guards. People were amazed at how still and focused they were. Jack, however, had a different idea. "I bet I can make one of them move," he thought to himself with a mischievous grin. Nearby, Jack saw a stray dog wandering around the palace gates. The dog was friendly and playful, wagging its tail at everyone who passed by. Jack's mind raced with an idea that he thought would be funny. He imagined recording a video of the dog interacting with the royal guard. To him, it seemed like a perfect plan to get lots of likes and comments on his social media. Jack crouched down and called the dog over. "Hey there, buddy," he said in a cheerful voice, pulling a small piece of food from his bag. The dog trotted over, sniffing curiously. Jack patted its head and whispered, "You and I are going to make some internet magic." While Jack was planning his stunt, people nearby started to notice what he was doing. Some smiled at the dog's playful behavior, while others gave Jack confused looks. They weren't sure what he was up to, but Jack didn't care. He was focused on his plan. The royal guard stood just a few feet away, completely still. His face was calm, his eyes looking straight ahead. Jack thought it was amazing how the guard didn't react to anything. But instead of respecting the guard's dedication, Jack saw it as an opportunity to make a joke. Jack began to toss small pieces of food closer and closer to the guard's boots, trying to get the dog's attention. The dog sniffed the ground and moved toward the guard, wagging its tail happily. Jack chuckled to himself, imagining how funny the video would look once it was uploaded. But as the dog got closer, a few people in the crowd began to look uneasy. They whispered to each other, wondering if Jack's actions were appropriate. "Isn't this disrespectful?" someone murmured. Another person frowned but didn't say anything. Jack, however, didn't notice the growing tension around him. He was too busy focusing on his camera and the dog. "Just a little closer," he whispered, getting ready to record the guard's reaction. He believed he was about to pull off the prank of a lifetime. The stage was set, and Jack's foolish plan was about to unfold. Little did he know, karma was already waiting for him. Jack's heart raced with excitement as the stray dog sniffed the ground, getting closer and closer to the royal guard. He held his phone steady, making sure to capture every second of what he thought would be a hilarious video. His fingers twitched, ready to press the record button at just the right moment. In his mind, he pictured the video going viral, the crowd laughing, and his social media followers flooding in with likes and comments. But things didn't go as planned. As the dog approached the guard's boots, Jack suddenly clapped his hands loudly, trying to get the dog's attention. The sound echoed through the air, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The dog's ears perked up, and it looked at Jack in confusion. Then, to Jack's surprise, the dog barked loudly and jumped forward, clearly startled by the noise. It charged toward the guard with all its energy, barking and wagging its tail. The guard didn't move an inch. He stood tall, his posture straight and serious, showing no sign of being affected by the dog's sudden excitement. The crowd, however, was reacting differently. People started stepping back, some even laughing nervously. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. Jack's grin began to fade as the dog grew more agitated. It circled the guard a few times, barking loudly, before it suddenly turned around. The dog now seemed focused on Jack, its eyes wide and its tail still wagging furiously. Jack's face froze as he realized what was happening. The dog, now more excited than ever, charged toward Jack. Before he could react, the dog jumped up, landing right in front of him and knocking him off balance. Jack stumbled back, trying to regain his footing, but it was too late. The dog's excitement had thrown him off his feet, and he lost his balance completely. With a loud splash, Jack fell right into a nearby fountain, the water splashing high into the air. The crowd burst into laughter, some clapping and others shaking their heads in disbelief. Jack, now soaking wet, struggled to get up, but the dog was already on its way back to the guard, clearly uninterested in him now. The royal guard stood perfectly still, unfazed by the chaos that had just unfolded. His expression never changed, and he didn't even glance at Jack. It was as if nothing had happened at all. Jack, now covered in water, looked around at the crowd, realizing that the joke had backfired completely. The laughter from the crowd echoed in his ears. Some people were still filming the entire scene on their phones, posting videos of Jack's embarrassing fall online. Jack's social media followers would surely see this, but it wasn't going to be the viral success he had imagined. As Jack stood there, drenched and humiliated, the reality of his mistake began to sink in. He had made a fool of himself, and instead of getting the attention he craved, he had become the joke. The crowd slowly started to disperse, their eyes still on Jack as they muttered about the situation. But Jack didn't hear them. His mind was too focused on the fact that his plan had gone horribly wrong, and that karma had found him instantly. As Jack stood there in the fountain, water dripping from his clothes, and his face flushed with embarrassment, he couldn't believe what had just happened. His phone, still recording, lay forgotten in his wet hands. The crowd's laughter rang in his ears, but it felt like the sound was far away, as if his mind had gone into a fog. For a moment, Jack just stood frozen, looking around at the people who were still laughing. Some were even taking pictures, capturing his soaking wet form in all its humiliation. He was a joke now, a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons. The dog, having gotten its attention, had returned to its relaxed state, and was now sitting calmly near the royal guard's feet. It was as if the dog had won, and Jack had lost everything. Despite his embarrassment, Jack couldn't help but feel a sting of anger. This wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered to himself. He had planned a funny prank to show off to his followers, but now he was the one who looked foolish. His fingers gripped the edges of the fountain as he tried to stand up, his knees shaking from the cold water. Just as Jack tried to pull himself out of the fountain, he saw the royal guard's shadow. The guard stood at attention, just a few feet away from Jack. The soldier's calm demeanor remained unchanged as he looked down at Jack, who was now struggling to get his footing. There was no sympathy in the guard's eyes, no sign that he even noticed Jack's failure. The soldier's focus was entirely on his duties, and Jack couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret. He had disrespected the guard, and now he was paying the price. Meanwhile, people in the crowd were still laughing, some even filming Jack's struggle to escape the fountain. The laughter seemed endless, but Jack knew he had no one to blame but himself. He had wanted to make a video for attention, but instead, he had become the punchline of his own joke. As Jack managed to climb out of the fountain, he could feel the weight of the situation settling on him. He was drenched, humiliated, and now he knew that everyone who saw the video would think of him as nothing more than a fool. No one was laughing with him. Everyone was laughing at him. The dog, who had been the star of his prank, was now the true winner of the day. It had done nothing but follow its instincts, and somehow it had made Jack's plan backfire in the most perfect way. Jack glanced around and saw that a few people were now walking away, still chuckling under their breath. His phone buzzed, and he realized the live video he had been recording was still running. The footage was filled with the sounds of his fall and the dog's playful barking, with Jack's splashes of water in between. His followers were already commenting, but the comments weren't the ones Jack had hoped for. They were filled with mockery and laughter at his expense. It hit Jack hard. The prank that was supposed to make him famous had instead made him a viral embarrassment. As he stood there, soaked and humiliated, he understood what had just happened. Karma had struck instantly. It wasn't the royal guard or the dog who had done this to him. It was his own foolishness, his own arrogance that had led to this moment. And now, Jack had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. The moment Jack realized what had happened, his phone buzzed again, a reminder that his embarrassing prank was far from over. The crowd, still amused by his fall, began to disperse, but not before capturing every moment on their phones. Jack's heart sank when he saw the first comment on his live video. What a joke. This guy thought he could mess with a royal guard and a dog. Look at him now. The laughter from the crowd echoed in Jack's ears as people walked away, leaving him standing there, drenched from head to toe. The dog, who had been the star of Jack's prank, was now happily sitting at the guard's feet. Jack had completely lost control of the situation. What was meant to be a funny stunt had turned into an embarrassing disaster. He was now the joke, and everyone seemed to enjoy it. It wasn't long before the video of Jack's fall went viral. The footage spread quickly across social media, with people tagging their friends and sharing it everywhere. By the time Jack checked his phone again, the video had been shared thousands of times. His notifications were flooded with messages, but not the kind he had hoped for. Wow, I knew something like this was going to happen. Karma got him good. One comment read. Another user wrote, "This is why you don't mess with the royal guards. Respect them." Jack scrolled through dozens of similar comments, his cheeks turning red with embarrassment. People weren't just laughing at him, they were criticizing him. His prank had crossed a line, and now he was paying the price. The video was everywhere. It was in memes, it was on news websites, and it was being talked about on every social media platform. The hashtag #KarmaJack was trending, and it was clear that Jack had become the punchline of an international joke. As Jack's phone continued to buzz with notifications, he couldn't escape the humiliation. He had been hoping to get attention for doing something funny and daring, but all he had achieved was making a fool of himself. His followers, who had once praised his bold stunts, now mocked him. "This is what happens when you disrespect others for a laugh," one follower commented. Another added, "If you can't handle the consequences, don't pull pranks like this." The worst part, Jack realized, was that he had done it for the wrong reasons. He had wanted to be famous for a prank, but he had only succeeded in being famous for the wrong reasons. His reputation was in shambles, and all the attention he had wanted had backfired. His online presence, which he had worked hard to build, was now at risk of disappearing. Despite the harsh comments and the flood of mockery, Jack couldn't help but think about the royal guard. The soldier had remained calm and professional throughout the entire ordeal. He hadn't moved an inch, and he hadn't even acknowledged Jack's ridiculous behavior. Jack felt a deep sense of respect for the guard's composure. He had tried to disrupt the guard's duty for a laugh, but in the end, it was the guard who had stood tall, unmoved by the chaos Jack had caused. Jack's phone buzzed one last time. This time, it was a message from a friend. "Hey, man, I saw what happened. I think you should take down that video before it gets worse." Jack stared at the screen, his mind racing. He knew his friend was right. It was time to face the consequences of his actions and stop hiding behind his phone. But for now, all he could do was stand there, surrounded by the echoes of laughter, and realize that the attention he had wanted so badly had come at a much higher cost than he had ever imagined. As the laughter from the crowd began to fade, Jack stood there in the fountain, still soaked and humiliated. The sound of his phone buzzing had stopped, but the weight of the situation was far from over. He felt eyes on him from every direction. Some people had already walked away, still chuckling to themselves, but a few remained, talking amongst themselves and staring at Jack. He glanced around nervously. His phone had stopped recording, but the damage had already been done. The live video had gone viral, and Jack's prank was no longer funny. It was a mistake, and everyone could see it. Just when Jack thought things couldn't get worse, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see two uniformed security officers walking toward him. They were serious, their eyes focused, and it was clear they weren't here to laugh. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, walked up to Jack and stopped a few feet away. "Are you the one who caused this disturbance?" the officer asked, his voice firm but calm. Jack swallowed hard, his stomach turning. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded, embarrassed beyond belief. "We've had multiple complaints about your behavior," the second officer said, his tone equally serious. "You've disrupted the peace and disrespected the Royal Guard." Jack's heart sank. He hadn't expected this level of attention from the authorities. He had only wanted a laugh, but now, the consequences were catching up with him. The officers didn't seem angry, but there was no mistaking that they were serious about their job. "We're going to have to ask you to come with us," the first officer said. Jack opened his mouth to protest, but then he remembered the scene he had caused. The dog, the guard, the fall into the fountain, the laughter from the crowd. And he knew there was no way out of this. The second officer took out a small notepad and began writing something down. "You'll be issued a fine for disturbing the peace and for creating a public nuisance. This kind of behavior is not acceptable, especially around royal grounds." Jack stood silently, still dripping wet, as the officers took down his information. He couldn't believe how quickly things had spiraled out of control. Just a few hours ago, he had been planning the perfect prank, hoping to become the center of attention. Now, he was facing the consequences of his actions. As the officers finished their paperwork, the first officer turned to Jack again. "You need to understand that your actions have consequences. We don't take these things lightly here. You've disrupted the duties of the Royal Guard and caused a disturbance in a place where people come to show respect." Jack nodded, his head hanging low. He could feel the eyes of the remaining crowd on him, some sympathetic, others judgmental. The embarrassment he had felt earlier now seemed small compared to the reality of what was happening. "Once we finish here, you'll need to leave the premises," the second officer added. "If you want to avoid further trouble, we suggest you take a moment to think about your actions." Jack didn't say anything as the officers handed him a ticket. It was a sharp reminder of how far he had fallen from his original plan. He had wanted attention, but this was not the kind of attention he had imagined. The officers turned to leave, and Jack was left standing there, still wet, still humiliated. The Royal Guard stood in the same position, completely unaffected by the scene that had just unfolded. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the soldier. The guard had handled everything with calm and grace, while Jack had acted out of impulse. As he walked away from the palace, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of regret. He had learned the hard way that not everything in life was a joke. And some things, like respect for others, were more important than any viral video. As the laughter from the crowd began to fade, Jack stood there in the fountain, still soaked and humiliated. The sound of his phone buzzing had stopped, but the weight of the situation was far from over. He felt eyes on him from every direction. Some people had already walked away, still chuckling to themselves, but a few remained, talking amongst themselves and staring at Jack. He glanced around nervously. His phone had stopped recording, but the damage had already been done. The live video had gone viral, and Jack's prank was no longer funny. It was a mistake, and everyone could see it. Just when Jack thought things couldn't get worse, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see two uniformed security officers walking toward him. They were serious, their eyes focused, and it was clear they weren't here to laugh. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, walked up to Jack and stopped a few feet away. "Are you the one who caused this disturbance?" the officer asked, his voice firm but calm. Jack swallowed hard, his stomach turning. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded, embarrassed beyond belief. "We've had multiple complaints about your behavior," the second officer said, his tone equally serious. "You've disrupted the peace and disrespected the Royal Guard." Jack's heart sank. He hadn't expected this level of attention from the authorities. He had only wanted a laugh, But now, the consequences were catching up with him. The officers didn't seem angry, but there was no mistaking that they were serious about their job. "We're going to have to ask you to come with us," the first officer said. Jack opened his mouth to protest, but then he remembered the scene he had caused. The dog, the guard, the fall into the fountain, the laughter from the crowd. And he knew there was no way out of this. The second officer took out a small notepad and began writing something down. "You'll be issued a fine for disturbing the peace and for creating a public nuisance. This kind of behavior is not acceptable, especially around royal grounds." Jack stood silently, still dripping wet, as the officers took down his information. He couldn't believe how quickly things had spiraled out of control. Just a few hours ago, he had been planning the perfect prank, hoping to become the center of attention. Now he was facing the consequences of his actions. As the officers finished their paperwork, the first officer turned to Jack again. "You need to understand that your actions have consequences. We don't take these things lightly here. You've disrupted the duties of the Royal Guard and caused a disturbance in a place where people come to show respect." Jack nodded, his head hanging low. He could feel the eyes of the remaining crowd on him, some sympathetic, others judgmental. The embarrassment he had felt earlier now seemed small compared to the reality of what was happening. "Once we finish here, you'll need to leave the premises," the second officer added. "If you want to avoid further trouble, we suggest you take a moment to think about your actions." Jack didn't say anything as the officers handed him a ticket. It was a sharp reminder of how far he had fallen from his original plan. He had wanted attention, but this was not the kind of attention he had imagined. The officers turned to leave, and Jack was left standing there, still wet, still humiliated. The Royal Guard stood in the same position, completely unaffected by the scene that had just unfolded. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the soldier. The guard had handled everything with calm and grace, while Jack had acted out of impulse. As he walked away from the palace, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of regret. He had learned the hard way that not everything in life was a joke, and some things, like respect for others, were more important than any viral video. As Jack walked away from the palace, ticket in hand, he couldn't help but feel a sinking feeling in his stomach. The royal palace, once a place of wonder and excitement, now seemed like a symbol of his mistake. He had gone there with a plan to be funny, to make people laugh, and gain attention. But now he was just a figure of ridicule, a man who had made a fool of himself in front of hundreds. The ticket he had received was more than just a fine. It felt like a mark of failure. It was a reminder that his actions had consequences, something he hadn't thought about when he first came up with the idea. He had been so caught up in the thrill of the prank and the potential popularity that he didn't consider the impact of his actions on others. Jack's phone buzzed again. He hesitated before checking it, already knowing what to expect. As he unlocked the screen, the first thing that popped up was a message from his best friend. "Hey man, saw what happened. You really messed up this time. You should take down that video before it gets worse." Jack sighed, staring at the screen. The video had already been shared thousands of times, and now it seemed like no one would let him forget his mistake. He had wanted to be the center of attention, but not like this. He wasn't sure how he could fix this, or if he even could. The crowd had long gone, but the echoes of their laughter seemed to follow him wherever he went. Jack had hoped to leave the palace and go back to his hotel room to cool off. But everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some smiled awkwardly, while others whispered as he passed by. He could feel their eyes on him, judging him for his behavior. Back in his hotel room, Jack plopped down on the bed, feeling the weight of the situation. He had let his need for attention cloud his judgment. He had been too focused on the idea of going viral, to the point where he didn't even think about the respect he owed to the Royal Guard and the people around him. He opened the video again, watching the part where he fell into the fountain. His face turned red as he saw himself stumble and fall, the dog happily trotting away as if nothing had happened. The comments on the video were full of mockery and laughter. "What a clown. One comment read, "This is what happens when you don't respect others." Read another. The feeling of embarrassment was overwhelming. Jack had been trying so hard to get people's attention, but now all he wanted was to disappear. He didn't want to be the punchline anymore, but there was no way to undo what had happened. The video was out there, and it wasn't going anywhere. As Jack sat there, staring at the screen, he began to think about the royal guard again. The soldier had stood there, calm and unmoved, throughout the whole ordeal. He hadn't reacted to the dog or the crowd, and he certainly hadn't shown any sign of being disturbed by Jack's prank. The guard had shown a level of professionalism and respect that Jack had completely ignored. Jack realized that he had learned a valuable lesson the hard way. He had disrespected someone who was simply doing their job, and now he was paying the price. The attention he had wanted had come, but it was not the kind he had imagined. It was a lesson in humility. He took a deep breath, looking at his phone one more time. Maybe it was time to change. Jack had learned his lesson, but it wasn't too late to make things right. It was time to stop looking for attention and start showing the respect he had forgotten about. Jack sat quietly in his hotel room, the bright glow of his phone screen lighting up his face as he stared at the comments flooding in. The video of his failed prank had gone viral, and it seemed like there was no escaping it. Every time he refreshed the page, more comments appeared, some mocking him, others calling him out for disrespecting the royal guard. It felt like the entire internet was laughing at him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. His chest tightened with the weight of embarrassment, regret, and frustration. He had wanted attention, but this wasn't the kind of attention he had imagined. He never thought his attempt to have some fun would end in such humiliation. But as he sat there, staring at the phone, a new thought crossed his mind. He couldn't keep running from what had happened. It wasn't just about a funny video anymore. It was about the lesson he had learned the hard way. The guard, who had remained calm and professional throughout the whole situation, kept appearing in Jack's thoughts. That soldier had done his job without reacting, without letting anything break his focus. Jack, on the other hand, had let his desire for a viral moment blind him to the importance of respect. He hadn't thought about the guard, about the dog, or even about the people around him who might feel uncomfortable or upset by his actions. He had been too wrapped up in his own world of social media likes and viral videos. Jack's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was another message from his friend, asking if he was okay. Jack stared at the screen for a moment before typing a response. He apologized for his actions, admitting that he had messed up. He told his friend that he didn't know what he was thinking when he pulled the prank, but now he understood the consequences. After sending the message, Jack stared at his reflection in the mirror across the room. His appearance hadn't changed, but he felt different. He knew that he had to change his mindset too. He couldn't keep chasing attention at the expense of others. The respect that the royal guard had shown, staying still, calm, and composed, was something Jack realized he needed to emulate. The next morning, Jack woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The internet may have mocked him, but he wasn't going to let that define him. He was determined to show that he could learn from his mistake. He decided to visit an animal shelter and volunteer, something that had been on his mind for a while, but had always been pushed aside. The dog in his prank had been a source of chaos, but Jack realized that animals deserved kindness and respect, not as pawns in a prank, but as living beings with feelings. At the shelter, Jack spent the day helping out, feeding the animals, and cleaning their spaces. It wasn't glamorous or exciting like his social media stunts, but it felt right. Helping others, showing kindness, and making a difference in small ways was something Jack had overlooked for far too long. The work wasn't easy, but it gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Jack's time at the shelter helped him understand the true meaning of respect and humility. He realized that his desire for attention had blinded him to what really mattered. It wasn't about viral videos or laughing at someone else's expense. It was about treating others with kindness, whether they were a royal guard, a stray dog, or anyone else. By the time Jack returned to his hotel later that day, he felt different. He had learned something important. The internet's laughter might have stung, but it had also been a wake-up call. Jack now understood the importance of respecting others, no matter where he was or who he was with. It was time to start fresh, to be someone who didn't seek attention for the wrong reasons, but for doing the right thing. Weeks had passed since Jack's embarrassing moment at the Royal Palace. The video of his failed prank had gone viral, and for a while, he couldn't escape the constant reminders of his mistake. People still made jokes about it online, and the hashtag #KarmaJack remained popular for a while. But over time, Jack began to notice something different. He wasn't as bothered by the comments as he had been before. Instead of feeling humiliated, he found himself thinking more about what had happened and what he had learned. He had taken some time away from social media to reflect on his actions. The first few days had been tough. He had been surrounded by the echoes of laughter and mockery, and it felt like the world was laughing at him. But as time passed, Jack began to see the bigger picture. He had made a mistake, yes, but that didn't define who he was. What mattered most was how he responded to it. Jack had apologized to his friend and the people who had witnessed the prank, and he had even made a public post explaining his actions. In the post, he admitted that he had been focused on the wrong things: attention, likes, and the excitement of the viral moment. He confessed that he hadn't taken the time to think about the people around him or the impact his actions might have. The royal guard, who had shown nothing but professionalism, was someone Jack now respected deeply. But Jack didn't stop there. He wanted to show that he had learned from his mistake, that he wasn't just apologizing for the sake of it. He started volunteering more at the animal shelter, dedicating his free time to helping the animals. He also began working with a local community group that focused on promoting kindness and respect in the community. Jack wanted to make a real difference, to show that he wasn't just someone who looked for attention, but someone who cared about making the world a better place. One afternoon, while working at the shelter, Jack had a conversation with a volunteer who had been working there for years. The volunteer spoke about how, sometimes, people made mistakes, but it was what they did afterward that mattered most. "It's not about being perfect," the volunteer said. "It's about learning from your mistakes and growing into a better person." Jack thought about those words long after their conversation. It was a simple truth, but it stuck with him. The prank he had pulled had been foolish, but it didn't define who he was. What mattered was that he had learned from it and made an effort to be better. He had been humbled by the experience, and he now saw the world through a different lens. As Jack continued to volunteer and get involved in the community, he noticed a change in himself. He didn't feel the need to seek out attention the way he used to. Instead, he felt a sense of fulfillment in doing good for others, in making small but meaningful contributions to the world around him. He no longer craved the spotlight for the wrong reasons. Instead, he wanted to be known for his kindness, his respect for others, and his willingness to make amends for his past mistakes. Months later, when Jack looked back on the incident at the palace, he no longer saw it as a source of embarrassment. It had been a turning point in his life, a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his days. He had learned that the path to redemption wasn't about avoiding mistakes. It was about owning up to them, learning from them, and using those lessons to grow into a better person. Jack wasn't perfect, and he didn't expect to be. But he was trying to be the best version of himself, and that, he realized, was what truly mattered.